Welcome everyone. Maternity is a long-standing theme in the arts of ancient Cyprus, enduring with interruptions from the Chalcolithic to the Hellenic ages of the island. One of those significant interruptions occurred between the late Chalcolithic and the early Bronze Age around 2300 BCE. This break is chronological, geographic, stylistic, and thematic. Before it, two maternal themes dominated southwestern Cyprus: the picrolite cruciform pendants that show a woman in the process of childbirth, and the terracottas from a cache from Kisonaga Mosphilia near Paphos on the southwestern coast of the island that depict stages of pregnancy and parturition. In short, women in the process of generation. After that gap, in the early Bronze Age, a new population from Anatolia introduced a new repertoire of female plank figurines, both individual or within scenic compositions. Approximately a third of these females were kourotrophic, shown holding an infant in a cradle board. In short, child care. It is this latter depiction that was to endure in Cyprus to the end of the Bronze Age, evolving into the bird face and then normal-faced figurines before being replaced entirely by the goddess with upraised arms. These final two images were completely devoid of kourotrophic iconography, marking the end of maternal iconography on the island until the Archaic Age in the 6th century BCE. The change in iconographies at the dawn of the Bronze Age sparked a discussion about women's status in Cyprus at the time. Specifically, did the new portrayal of woman as caretaker, as opposed to creator, accompany a fall of status for women? The change correlates with the secondary products revolution, where a possible sex-based division of labor led men to work outdoors in primary production, that is, planting and harvesting of grain, herding of animals, and women to be working in a more domestic context in a secondary product processing, that is, making the bread or making the cheese. As the men were producers, while the women were merely processors, males came to be seen as property owners. Thus, the secondary products revolution became a contributor to the rise of patriarchy. So, if males were also understood to be givers of new life and reproduction, as does appear to be the case where we get texts from the Near East and the Mediterranean, then this ideology would correlate with the change in Cypriot iconography, whereby women went from producers of children to merely nourishers and caretakers of men's offspring. This presentation is a consideration of the iconographic evidence for women's status in Bronze Age Cyprus, with a particular interest in the kourotropos and maternity in the terracotta imagery. To begin, let us consider the new portrayal of women in early Bronze Age Cyprus, the plank figurine, and the similar scenic compositions. At its most basic, the plank figurine is a roughly rectangular, two-dimensional rendering, anthropomorphic mostly in the human face with eyes, nose, ears, very rarely mouth. Jewelry is extremely common, as are decorative elements on the face and clothing. The appearance of breasts as sexual markers on several examples, along with the complete absence of any phallic bulge, indicates that these figurines are female. This sexual identity is bolstered by several examples which are kourotrophic, as kourotrophi are almost exclusively female throughout the Bronze Age Near East and Mediterranean. And this again points to identification as female. It has been suggested by Anna Campo, Marcia Magdalonsky, and others that these objects are highly distinctive in their patterned garb and represent individual women, possibly at different phases of life, and may have played some role in rituals involving the exchange of women throughout early Cypriot communities, for example, in marriage. No equivalent exists for males. When appearing on very simplified scenic compositions, decorated bowls, for example, they are often paired with solitary males, perhaps indicating some kind of nuclear family. In such cases, the female sex of the one figure is presented via the baby she holds, a sex indicator as much as her breasts. While individual plank figurines reveal little about women's status on Cyprus, we can learn more from the scenic compositions. These are terracotta sculptures of daily life that have come to light in a number of burials dated to the early and middle Cypriot periods. The sculptures show scenes of, for example, plowing, herding, bread or winemaking, religious or funerary scenes, and images of lovemaking. They were found exclusively in funerary contexts and almost certainly were used as signs of elite status. On them, we see depictions of the community in action, as least as understood, and thus provide a better view of women in society than was possible with the individual plank figurines. Three particular scenic compositions shed light on women specifically as mothers. The first is the Pierotis bowl, a 28 centimeter tall early Cypriot 3, middle Cypriot 1 red polished vessel said to have been discovered at Margi and now in the Pierotis collection at Larnaca. The upper rim is decorated with scenes of sexual reproduction and food processing. One side shows a couple embracing, a male and a much larger female. To the left is a woman with a very swollen belly, clearly in advanced stages of pregnancy. This woman has breasts in relief and incised genitals. Past this woman are an animal and human holding a pounder and standing by a trough. And at the far left is another extremely pregnant woman, this time with very large breasts and a clay pellet upon the incised genitalia. It is clear she's giving birth. The far side, side B, has a repeat of the male-female embrace motif, although here the male is rendered with very large genitalia. Next to this couple is an infant in a cradle board. Other figures decorating the rim are people engaged in bread making. This series is the only known portrayal of sexual reproduction in all its phases from Bronze Age Cyprus. While the emphasis is on the female role, it cannot be denied that unlike the Chalcolithic, the male is shown playing an initial and rather integral role in the process. The second scenic composition is the Vunus bowl. This terracotta from tomb 22 at Belpais Vunus is a bowl with one arched entrance. To either side of the entrance, are corrals where bovines stand. Standing directly before one of these corrals is a kourotropos, the only female in the scene. In the central area stand 6 human figures, of which 3 have phallic bulges. Beyond these, on a bench at the edge of the bowl sit 6 large humanoid figures, of which 2 are clearly male. Just past these seated figures, a male with phallus stands facing an architectural structure comprised of 3 vertical pilasters topped by horned animal heads, a shrine. The most significant figure in the bowl is a large male who sits upon an enormous chair or throne facing that shrine. Edgar Peltenberg divided up the bowl based on zones of activity and the size of the characters. Issues of scale are especially pertinent here. The larger size of the seated males is exponential. They're not just taller than everyone else in the scene. Such gigantism may be intended to reveal greater status or even divinity. And please note, only clear males are of greater size. Concerning the zones of activity, Peltenberg writes, and I quote, "Sectors or thematic units are defined as having their own internal dynamic focus. In C, near the entrance, are penned bulls with their keepers, and observing the cattle, the only female holding a child. In Sector B is a self-contained group of standing males with arms folded, looking at one another. There is no hint of movement. And in the group's inward-looking stance, no contact with adjacent sectors. In A are seated and kneeling figures engaged in some rite before and to either side of bucranial pillars. The largest male, seated on an elaborate chair, presides over the proceedings, and he is directly opposite to the iconographic devices on the wall. Viewed in this manner, it may be seen that the compositional structure of the bowl was deliberately designed as a hierarchy, one perhaps expressive of a general social ideology. Thus, at the base of this hierarchical construct, C, are bulls, symbols of new wealth, status, resources, and a female with child, also suggestive of vitality, fertility, and prosperity. The woman-child figure is intentionally associated with the cattle by her position and the direction of her face. She's looking at the bulls. Next, B, the adult world of decision-making males. Beyond that, A, sacred rights before symbols of transcendent powers, which, if conceptually related with sectors B and C, effectively legitimate the whole social structure. Put simply, the iconography of the Venus Bowl suggests that a system of social elites was forming in Cyprus, and women were on the lower end of the sex status spectrum, appearing in the same category as cattle. Although it might be argued that some of the sex-neutral characters in the composition may also be understood as female, left neutral because, unlike the kourotropos, sex or gender is not relevant to their depictions, one must also note the atypical emphasis on male sexual attributes in the larger characters. Sex clearly seems to be an issue in this composition. The emphasis on male primacy appears to be even further emphasized on the Pyrgos jug, now in the Limassol Museum. This 46-centimeter tall red polished ware jug came to light in a tomb of the Pyrgos necropolis. To one side of the spouts, a male with phallic bulge and well-incised facial features sits on an elaborately rendered chair or potentially throne. By his feet stands a kourotropos, holding an infant at her left side. At his other side sits another kourotropos with relatively large breast, fully incised facial features, and a large infant in her arms resting upon her lap. The only other character in this grouping is the diminutive, unsexed individual who holds a tiny jug in the left arm. On the other side, don't worry about it, of the spouts is a male with phallic bulge and clearly rendered facial features who sits upon a stool. Next to him are three individuals working a giant pounder in a round vessel. On the other side of that man, an individual is working a plow pulled by bulls. Underneath the double spouts are three individuals bent over a trough, probably kneading bread. A fourth such character stands just behind them, next to the seated kourotropos. And at the base of the spouts is a woman stomping grapes for wine. As with the Venus bowl, positions of status are clearly held by male individuals. The person with the highest apparent status is the enthroned male. His elaborate chair highlights his significance in the scene. Both kourotropoi in the scene appear on either side of his feet, while a tiny individual with jug stands by his feet. It is possible that this is a scene of very literal patriarchy, the paternal figure presiding over two females with babies and a slightly older child. Thus, not only is the person with highest apparent status male, he is enthroned and emphasized within a specifically familial context. The only other character in the composition who is seated and not working is the male on the other side of the spouts. This may, of course, represent an older, functionally retired individual. Nevertheless, his position gives the impression of one managing the workers on his side of the jug, just as his greater facial detail makes him appear more prominent in the general context of the composition. Remembering that all scenic compositions were funerary in nature, it is possible to suggest that the enthroned male of the Pyrgos jug represented the honored dead to whom the jug was dedicated. This might explain his higher status in the scene. Nevertheless, it is worth noting that this male's display of status occurs in what appears to be a familial context. The patriarch appears as ruler, specifically when surrounded by women with babies and children. When contrasted with the presence of working sex-neutral individuals on other parts of the jug, this may suggest that if patriarchy were on the rise in Cyprus, it was occurring within a familial domestic context. So an initial survey of some of the more significant works in terracotta from early Bronze Age Cyprus suggests that mothers were seen as secondary members of a male-dominated society. When shown in the company of men, kourotropoi are depicted with less power, either through size, placement, or seating arrangements. Even so, the iconographic record is not entirely depressing regarding the role of women in early Cyprus. Very significant and offering a counter to the imagery of the Venus model is the Middle Cypriot shrine model from Marghi, the best preserved of three such shrine models of red polished ware. Here we see a wall, once again, this should look familiar, with three vertical pilasters topped with horn animal heads. Such structures, architectural structures, have come to light in funerary architecture, as with Tomb 6 at Karmi, suggesting that the tombs and the models functioned as sites of ancestor cult. In two of the models, an amphora or jar sits below the central pilaster, and a human stands before the amphora. Where the sex of the human can be determined, it is a female with breasts. As sex-based occupations tend to be consistent in scenic compositions, this might suggest that women were the standard funerary cult ritualists for whatever counted as religion in early Cyprus. A similar suggestion has been made for a group of women at a grinding bench on an amphora now in the Musée National de Céramique in Sévères. In contrast to most contemporary grinding platforms, which were found individually, so for one person only and at floor level, these three standing women worked before a waist-high grinding platform large enough to accommodate 3 or 4 grinders. This is identical to an actual grinder discovered at the site of Sotira, including 2 in situ grinding stones, in what the excavator identified as a cult place. If that identification be correct, then it would again appear that women took part in the preparation of religious ritual. In short, women played a significant role in early Cypriot religion. Furthermore, evidence from the terracotta repertoire indicates that not only did women contribute extensively to the Cypriot economies as well as religion by their labor, but that social networks existed amongst women in the early and middle Cypriot Bronze Ages. In addition to the group grinding scene, an early Cypriot terracotta now in the Louvre shows a group of women working together around a large basin. The one to the far left, carries a child, while the one to the far right holds a water jug, both indicative of female sex. While the central figures give the impression of women working at the local basin, the woman with her hands engaged with the baby also provide a sense of camaraderie, women gathering together to chat while dealing with the daily chores. As such, female work groups networks counter the tendency towards male bonding versus female isolation with concomitant drops in female status. Men were also involved in domestic production, of course, but both the scenic compositions and ethnographic comparanda indicate that the sex-based division of labor typically saw older adolescent and adult males working in the fields, which were divided along family or clan lines. As such, males worked alongside other males within their own kin groups. Females, by contrast, worked with females within the greater community. This, combined with marriage practices that caused women to form links between households, led Carol Myers, writing about the Levant in this instance, nevertheless to conclude, quote, indeed, not only because of their group labor, but also because of their marital and consanguinal ties, women were better positioned than men to mediate inter and intra-community relations, end quote. Even so, the tendency towards isolation and concomitant lowering of women's status is hinted at in the domestic architecture, specifically in the breaking down of such women's networks with increased isolation within individual households. Households turn increasingly inwards over the course of the Bronze Age, with evidence of traditionally women's crafts relegated to interior, isolated spaces. For example, analysis of the domestic units at Middle Bronze Age Margi and Central Cyprus revealed that most, if not all, small-scale domestic industries took place within the home. From around 2000 BCE, these homes showed changes in structure, such as walled courtyards and subdivided interior spaces with increasingly limited access, that suggest a growing concern with household privacy and defense of domestic property. Within these guarded units, evidence for production came to light in rooms with permanent hearth structures. To quote excavator Jenny Webb, discarded objects include spindle whorls and loom weights, mortars and pounders, grinding equipment, pecking stones, weights, work surfaces, pins, needles, scrapers and chisels, bowls, jugs, juglets, baking pans, and cooking pots. These imply that the processing and small-scale storage of cereals and other foods, spinning and weaving, woodworking, and stone tool production were carried out indoors, along with cooking and eating. End quote. This trend towards domestic privatization continued into the late Bronze Age throughout the island. Analyzing developments in domestic architecture and urban planning at Kourion, Kalavasos, Enkomi, Kitian, and others, Diane Bolger noted several factors that would impact on women's domesticity, socialization, and status, including 1, the replacement of traditional agglomerative settlement plans with independent freestanding structures. 2, the positioning of doorways to limit public access and afford greater privacy. 3, the the functional segregation of work activities, including the construction of special purpose-built buildings. And 4, an increasing privatization of domestic activities, such as interior courtyards, including the privatization of water supply. What all the architectural data indicate is that there was a clear trend towards domestic isolation occurring over the course of Bronze Age in Cyprus, and that more likely than not, it was women who were relegated into these houses. With greater isolation comes less social engagement, fewer mutual support groups, and a general drop in social status within the community. Along with this process was the eroding of maternal iconography. The Cypriot late Bronze Age was a period of intensive contacts, first with the Levant and slightly later the Aegean. Levantine influence was strong in Cypriot religion, affecting the design of sanctuaries and the portrayal of deities. Significant was the adoption of specifically Syrian-style nude female iconography into the Cypriot repertoire, showing a clear continuity with early and then middle Cypriot styles. It's important to observe that the Syrian forebears of this style are never kourotrophic. What they represent for the Levantine clientele, it is not motherhood. Even so, the kourotrophic tradition in Cyprus was so strong that the Cypriots adapted the Syrian iconography to represent their own worldview. If the nude female represents a goddess in Cyprus, then that goddess is distinctly maternal, the end of a long line of maternal females in the Cypriot tradition. Whatever was happening to maternal iconography or imagery in the mundane world, motherhood still had its place in the divine realm until it didn't. When Aegean styles took over in late Cypriot III, so around 1200 BCE, all maternal iconography left the Cypriot corpus. However, the goddess or goddesses of Cyprus were envisioned, it was not as a mother. Any connection between maternity and power ceased to exist by the dawn of the Iron Age. When maternal iconography did finally reemerge on the island, it was in the form of Greek childbirth images and the Phoenician Dea Gravida. But we are now dealing with the distance of 6 centuries and 2 changes of population. Thank you.